Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week, we're going to be talking about free will. Okay, so questions about free will come in a variety of different forms. Right? We can ask, what exactly do we mean when we talk about free will? Is there such a thing as free will? And how does free will relate to our views about morality? Hopefully, we can touch on all of these questions today. Okay, so let's start by looking at the variety of positions that are available to us. So, of the available positions about this topic, philosophers generally focus on three main options. Here we have libertarianism, and note that libertarianism here is not the same thing as the political position, right? Hard determinism and compatibilism, sometimes called soft determinism. Today, the more contemporary way of calling it just is compatibilism, though. So, generally speaking, libertarians about free will believe that we, in fact, do have free will. Hard determinists deny that we have free will categorically. There's no such thing as free will. And compatibilists argue that they're in some kind of middle ground, right? They do think free will exists, but not quite the same thing as what the libertarian is suggesting. How the compatibilists can have a kind of middle ground, we're going to see later. But before we can understand the compatibilist, we need to know exactly what determinism is. So, determinism is just this idea that everything that has happened and will happen is an unavoidable product of the things that happened before. So, determinists believe then that everything that you and I do is an inevitable product of past causes. That means that everything that you think, every choice that you're going to make, all the beliefs that you're going to form, those are all the result of forces that are already in action. The idea is like when you knock over dominoes, right? The dominoes are going to fall after the first one is pushed, assuming things have been arranged correctly, right? And there's nothing that can really be done to stop that. It's not under the power of the last domino not to fall over. That's happening. It's been set in motion. So determinists think the same thing is true of everything that you and I are ever going to do, right? It's already been set in motion. It's going to happen, regardless of what you want to be the case. So, first, we should make a distinction here, right? We should be sure not to confuse this notion of determinism with something like fate, right? The notion of fate is very similar, right? Fate is also making the claim, or the notion of fate, rather, also requires this kind of idea that everything we're ever going to do is determined, right? So it seems like, in some respect, they're very similar. But fate seems to implicitly require that things had to be this way, right? You were fated to do this. There was nothing that could have been different. That's not quite the case with determinism, right? With determinism, we are going to do the things we're going to do. That's true. Everything is now determined, but everything's now determined by the things that came before. If the things that came before were different, well, what happens in the future could have been different as well. Right? So it's a slightly different view as a sort of fatalist view, right? It's the fatalist seems to be suggesting that no, things had to be this way. The determinist doesn't accept that. Things did not have to be this way, but they did happen this way. And therefore, our future is completely determined. No one had to knock over the first domino. That didn't have to happen. But once it did happen, now everything's going to fall apart, right? So there is a subtle distinction to be made between something like determinism and fate, right? It's not until the ball starts rolling for the determinist that our futures are determined. Okay, incompatibilism. More or less, incompatibilism is the idea that determinism and free will cannot mix, that the two are incompatible, right? So if you think that what I just described as determinism does not allow any room for something like free will, then you are very likely an incompatibilist. The idea is this: how can we truly be free if everything that I'm going to do, everything I'm ever going to think, has been determined by past events far before my personal existence? Right? If before I even existed, what I was going to say, what I was going to do, what I was going to think, all of these things were determined by past events, in what way am I free? Couldn't have done otherwise. That position is called incompatibilism. Okay, so incompatibilism is a broad view that's held by two different kinds of proponents. The first are the libertarians. These are the people who say, yeah, determinism and free will don't mix, but luckily for us, determinism's not true, right? Therefore, free will exists. Then there are the hard determinists. These are the people who are going to suggest that no, in fact, determinism is true and incompatibilism is true. What follows is that we have to reject free will. Compatibilists are, as I said, soft determinists, right? Soft determinists ought to give you a bit of a clue if compatibilism hasn't. Hold the idea that free will can coexist with determinism, that even if determinism is true, we could still have free will. So, how is that possible? How can we be free if everything that we're ever going to do, everything we are ever going to think, has already been determined? Well, the compatibilist tries to suggest that the libertarian notion of free will, which we'll get to soon, is mistaken, and that if we correct this mistake, the answer is pretty easy. So what did they mean by free will? What does the compatibilist mean by free will? Well, simply put, they mean that you are free so long as there's no kind of external compulsion. So basically the idea is this: so long as no one is forcing you to make a particular decision, to do a particular thing, to have a particular kind of thought, then you're acting freely. So if you're not being coerced, like at gunpoint or threatened or economically coerced in some way, right? Bribed, whatever. So long as you're not coerced, you're free. You're acting under your own free will. That's more or less the whole story for them. But you can ask the question, why does this matter? Why does my volition matter if everything I'm going to do has been determined already? The compatibilist is acknowledging that that's true. Everything you're ever going to do, everything you're ever going to think, has already been determined by the events that came before, right? So why does it matter that I'm not being, compelled to do one thing or the other by someone else? Am I not, in some sense, being compelled by the world? Well, we'll look at that question at the end of the lecture. Let's jump now to hard determinism. So once again, the hard determinist has two beliefs here, right? First, they're incompatibilist. So they think that free will and determinism do not mix. They cannot go together. Second, crucially, they think that determinism is true. What falls out of that logically, free will can't exist. So why might you want to be a hard determinist then? Well, most, but not all, hard determinists are these particular kind of scientistic philosophers, or I think you could be anyone and be a hard determinist, right? Not just philosophers, who think that the universe operates in a kind of mechanical clockwork fashion, right? So they think, for instance, that there are laws that govern how things behave, and that these laws are unchanging. They're universal and unchanging. So everything that has ever occurred and will ever occur just is a result of these laws. So the future is fixed for a hard determinist because the laws that govern the universe are fixed. These are the rules by which things have to operate. Once you have those rules in place, as soon as you knock over the first domino, everything else is going to play out because of those laws, right? So everything that we ever do or think must be fixed in place. Okay. There is, however, a rarer form of hard determinism that comes out of certain kinds of religious traditions. And some kinds of religious traditions believe that God has set things in a particular motion that can't be changed. Okay, so there's a difference, once again, between something like fate and this particular kind of view. A lot of religious thinkers also go in for something like fate, wherein God has decided from the beginning what's going to become of you. But there are other kinds of religious traditions that suggest that no, God has just set up the rules, and the rules are unchanging, and God kind of pushes the first domino. It's going to end up having a similar kind of result as the scientistic hard determinist. So long as the rules are inflexible, they have to be the same all the time, you're going to end up with a fixed result. You're going to end up with a determined result, no matter whether you're talking about universal laws of physics or laws that God has imposed on the universe. Right? Okay. Well, there are some reasons to think that this kind of clockwork view of the universe is wrong, right? The clockwork model of the universe derives from classical or Newtonian physics, which most physicists now believe to have been supplanted by quantum physics, or at least they'll say it's incomplete, right? Newtonian physics is still pretty good when it comes to making certain kinds of predictions, like predictions about large-scale phenomena, but it seems to importantly fail where other kinds of phenomena are concerned. Within quantum physics, there are these kind of phenomena that might make room for a certain degree of uncertainty, right? Remember, the determinists seemed like they needed this kind of fixed one event following the other, right? We can say, knowing all these background conditions and the initial state, we can say for sure what's going to happen next. Well, if you have uncertainty in the system, that's no longer the case. You can no longer predict, knowing all the past information, what's going to come next, right? So there are certain kinds of quantum phenomena, like the uncertainty principle, that might suggest the universe does not operate in this kind of clockwork-like fashion. So the hard determinist has two kinds of replies, right? They can argue that things like the uncertainty principle don't apply to the actions of macro scale phenomena like humans. So even if there is some kind of uncertainty in the universe, it is not occurring at the level where we matter, where thinking things occur, right? And therefore, it's still safe to say that the machinations of thinking things like us are completely determined, right? So even if you do grant a bit of uncertainty, it doesn't follow that our thoughts, our actions, etc., are not determined. Second, they could say that even if the uncertainty principle did cause some or all of human actions to be probabilistic in some way, that's not enough to bias free will. Introducing randomness, the idea goes, doesn't get us authorship of our actions, right? So you still don't get to claim free will. If a thing happens randomly, that doesn't mean you're responsible for it. So this kind of move, the hard determinist is going to suggest, if it does apply to macro scale phenomena, which they think is perhaps dubious, it's still not going to be enough to get you free will, right? That's still not going to be enough to get you free will. Okay, the next kind of argument that we might consider for hard determinism is more philosophical in nature than an appeal to this kind of particular scientific view of the world. It begins by asking us to consider the origins of our own thoughts. So, what are you thinking of right now? Did you decide to think of that thing? And if you say yes, did you decide to think of thinking of that thing? So you can see likely where this goes. There's a good chance that you did decide to think of whatever you're thinking of. But if you hadn't, you could see how your thinking of that thing isn't free. In order to be free, the incompatibilist claims, you need to be the author of your thought. You need to be responsible for them from start to finish. Okay. So the problem is going to be that at some point it seems like you can't claim authorship, right? Let's look at another example. I'm thinking about a polka dotted elephant right now. The hard determinist could say, oh, but did you decide to think about that elephant? Or did that thought just happen to you? Because if that thought just happened to you, it doesn't count as a free thought. Oh, well, yeah, I deliberately started thinking about the elephant. It was my choice. The hard determinist says, oh, great, okay, that's good. But did you choose to form the thought that you would choose to think about the elephant? Or did that just happen to you? Because if that just happened to you, it wasn't your choice. You were determined, right? Well, I didn't think about the thought of choosing to think of the elephant before I did. No. Hard determinist? Well, unfortunately, that means you're not in control of what you were thinking. Your thoughts aren't free. At some point, it seems like we have to acknowledge I didn't put the effort in to having this thought. It just happened. And if the thought just happened, you can't claim authorship, right? Can't claim authorship. Okay. Libertarianism. This is the opposite of the hard determinist in some ways, right? They think with the hard determinist, incompatibilism is true. You cannot have determinism and have free will. But, importantly, the libertarian rejects determinism, which allows them room to think that free will does exist. So, why should we be libertarians then about free will? Well, the first reason that they typically provide is that it just seems like we have it. When I'm talking to you now, when I'm going about my day, it seems like I'm making choices, right? I'm making choices and things happen as a result of those choices. It seems like those choices matter. So the hard determinist, of course, is going to say that, look, that feeling does not make the difference, right? Just because you feel like you're having a real influence on what you do doesn't mean that you actually do have that power. Second, the hard determinist is going to insist that you're determined to have that feeling. Even your thought that, oh, well, no, hard determinism must be false, even that thought would have been determined by the prior events, right? But libertarians, nevertheless, do typically insist that this appeal to common sense counts in their favor, right? Look, common sense is on our side, the side of having free will. Second argument has to do with moral responsibility. The idea is this: moral responsibility might depend on the notion of free will. If we don't have free will, then how responsible can we really be for our actions? Right? We typically like to say that what you did was morally right, and therefore you're worthy of praise, or it was morally wrong, and therefore you're worthy of some kind of blame, right? But if you couldn't help it, if what you did was going to happen, since, I don't know, the universe began, it seems sort of strange to say that you're somehow responsible for the things that you do. If a murderer was already determined to kill their victim by the very nature of the universe, can we really hold the murderer personally accountable? Literally, by determinism's lights, they couldn't have done anything else. There's generally two different ways of responding to this critically. The first, which is typically the way the hard determinist responds, is to say, that's true, but the universe is deterministic. So we should change the way that we evaluate people's morality, or simply accept the negative consequence that some people are determined to be morally bad, right? So answer, yeah, that's tough, right? That's tough. But determinism is true, and that doesn't change the fact that determinism is true. It just means morality is either weird or we need to rework it, right? Second, following that last line of thought, comes from the consequentialist, right? Consequentialist is going to say something like, whether or not free will exists doesn't matter where morality is concerned, because the way we assess the moral rightness or wrongness of an action just has to do with its consequences. We're not out here trying to assess whether or not someone is worthy of being blamed or is worthy of being praised. We're just trying to evaluate consequences. Were the consequences good? Then it was good. Were the consequences bad? It was morally bad. That's really all there is to say. And so free will doesn't really affect our ability to decide what's morally right and wrong. We just look at the consequences, right? You might also want to be a libertarian if you reject the idea of physicalism. So unless you belong to that specific group of religious thinkers that think that God sort of created the universe in this mechanistic way, wherein the universe has to abide by these laws that God set forth at the beginning, um, then you might think that this kind of law-like way of understanding the universe from a physicalist point of view is just wrong altogether, right? Maybe physicalism itself is wrong. So remember from our discussion about the philosophy of mind, physicalism is just the view that everything that exists has to be physical, right? So these kinds of libertarians then could be dualists, right? They might believe in two different kinds of substances. There's the mind stuff, and then there's physical. They might even be idealists who say there is no physical stuff at all, there's just the mental. So sure, they might say the physical world is governed by those kind of fixed laws, but minds are not, because they're not the same kind of substance. Maybe the physical world does have to operate deterministically. That doesn't mean the mental world does. And maybe that's why it feels like we have the ability to make choices. It's because the mental world's not constrained by those same universal laws. Okay, so that, of course, in and of itself, doesn't justify a belief in free will. It's not an argument for free will, but it does leave the door open for the possibility, right? Merely saying, look, the universe isn't completely, right? It could be partially, but at least it's not completely deterministic because, look, there's this mental stuff. This mental stuff doesn't operate according to physical laws. It doesn't mean that free will necessarily exists. It could be the case that the mental realm is also bound by these universal laws, maybe of a different kind, but still fixed universal laws. If that's true, free will is still not going to be the case for the incompatibilist. Nevertheless, non-physicalism might open the door for free will to be possible. Okay, so let's go back to compatibilism then. So how can there be this middle ground between these two extremes, right? Libertarianism, which says free will exists, and hard determinism, which says it can't. It seems like it's just yes and no. How is there a middle between yes and no? Well, the compatibilist, recall, finds middle ground by adjusting what it means to have free will. So we're no longer interested in authorship or being the thing, being ultimately responsible for what you do, right? We're no longer interested in that. For compatibilist, free will just means you're able to choose your actions without being coerced, right? So it's the absence of external force that makes you free. So Arthur Schopenhauer, a famous compatibilist, sums the idea up best. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. In other words, you are determined. Everything is determined. But that doesn't mean that you can't go about coerced or uncoerced, right? In other words, you can choose to do whatever you want, but you can't choose to want to do that thing. Your act can be free from external pressures, but you can't choose the way that you're going to act. So, question, is this really a middle ground, or is it an answer to a different question altogether? Most incompatibilists are going to argue that, look, the compatibilist here, they're attempting to change the rules of the game. We're asking whether or not this thing exists, this notion of free will. You're just changing the rules so that you can say free will exists, but you're not talking about the same thing anymore. You're not even addressing the same issue. We don't care about coercion, we care about authorship, right? But compatibilists are typically going to respond. There's little use in continuing to talk about that kind of free will because it's just not possible, right? Given that the universe is determined, remember, compatibilists are determinist, there is no such thing as that kind of free will. It doesn't exist. So why not introduce the notion of free will that is possible? Maybe you think that's a fair move. Maybe you don't. I'm going to ask you your thoughts on this one in an upcoming assignment, right? So have this in mind. Does the compatibilist offer an answer to the question that we're considering here? Do they offer an answer to the question of free will? Or have they changed the rules of the game? Right? Well, that's it for this week. So stay healthy, stay safe. See you next time.